Welcome to this history channel, where forgotten stories turn alive again. Today we journey back to the year 1851 to witness one of the greatest turning points in human civilization, the Great Exhibition of London. Imagine a building made entirely of glass and iron, stretching across Hyde Park like something from another world. Inside it, people saw electricity for the first time, telegraphs sending messages at lightning speed, steam engines shaking the floor with power, carpets from Persia, jewels from India, ancient art from Egypt, weapons from America, new music, new science, and cultures from every corner of the earth. This was not just a fair. It was the moment the world recognized itself. Inside the Crystal Palace, empires clashed without weapons. Technology replaced war as the measurement of power. Art stood side by side with science. Children met a future their parents never dreamed possible. Ideas about education, gender, industry, medicine, transportation, architecture, capitalism, religion, culture, and empire rewrote the shape of modern society. In today's 2-hour story, you will see how machines changed identity, how museums were born, how global trade evolved, how railways shrank the world, how art exploded into new expression, how workers found new voice, and how the Great Exhibition became blueprint for our modern age of internet, globalization, skyscrapers, and mass communication. If you want to understand how the modern world was built, this is the beginning. If you want to see the birth of global culture, this is the birthplace. If you want to feel history breathing, this is the chapter. So sit back, open your imagination, and travel into the Crystal Palace. Because what happened in 1851 still shapes who we are today. Welcome to the story. The story of the Great Exhibition of 1851 truly begins decades before the giant glass palace rose in London's Hyde Park. To understand why the event became a global turning point, we must explore the social, political, and economic transformations of early 19th century Britain. After the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution began reshaping every level of human society. Factories expanded across northern England. Coal mines powered machines. Steam engines replaced horse labor, and textile mills changed how people dressed, worked, and lived. These inventions did not simply make new products. They altered human identity. Workers moved from rural areas to crowded cities, leaving behind farming traditions and entering wage-based labor systems. Meanwhile, political debates exploded between conservative aristocrats and liberal reformers who demanded rights for the working poor. Britain was becoming richer, faster, and stronger, and also more unstable. Amid these dramatic changes, there was a powerful desire among reform-minded thinkers to demonstrate that technology could lead not only to profit, but to social progress, peace, and moral improvement. Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, became one of these central figures. He believed technology was not just industrial force, but an international language that could unite nations. Albert envisioned an event where inventors, scientists, engineers, and artists from every nation would stand beside one another in present achievements without war, colonial rivalry, or political suspicion. He imagined a world where progress was not limited to European powers, but open to every culture. Britain was ready for a display that would prove its leadership role in science and empire. But another reason drove the plan: fear. The revolution of 1848 spread across Europe, bringing riots, the fall of monarchies, violent street battles, and demands for democracy. The British ruling class worried that the same fire might ignite in London if economic hardship continued. Reformers believed a great international exhibition could inspire hope, encourage patriotism, and distract the working class from revolutionary ideas. If people saw science, art, and invention as gateways to a better future, they might abandon violent political dreams. That is why the exhibition was not just a show of machines. It was an attempt to stabilize an uneasy world. The year's newspapers advertised the exhibition as an educational and moral triumph waiting to happen. The concept took shape inside the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, RSA. Members traveled across Europe, studying earlier industrial fairs that had occurred in France and Germany. None were truly global. None involved architecture on a massive new scale, and none included colonial displays. Britain wanted to go beyond European boundaries. It wanted the world. Queen Victoria approved the plan, giving the project royal legitimacy. With monarchy behind it, the idea transformed from inspiration into unstoppable reality. The exhibition would be the world's first true industrial Olympics. It would combine science, culture, and economics, showing every visitor that human ingenuity could turn imagination into living spectacle. By 1850, British newspapers spread excitement like wildfire, claiming the future was coming and London would host it. The world did not yet know that this project would forever change museums, technology, architecture, and international exhibitions. The Great Exhibition of 1851 would become the ancestor of world fairs and modern expos. It would change how people saw empire, consumption, and culture. It would define Victorian identity. And above all, it would create a stage where one global story, shared through steam and glass, would shine. To prepare London for such an extraordinary international event, leaders needed a structure unlike anything ever built. Traditional masonry buildings were too slow and expensive. Wood was risky. Millions of people were expected to visit, and fire could destroy years of effort. Engineers, architects, and industrial designers met repeatedly to imagine a revolutionary solution. The Royal Commission, formed by Prince Albert in January of 1850, gathered hundreds of proposals. Many were spectacular fantasies. Colossal domes taller than cathedrals, iron towers that pierce clouds, and permanent monuments designed to glorify British rule over the empire. Yet most plans were expensive, dangerous, or simply impossible within a short timeline. Britain had less than a year to create something breathtaking. In the midst of this pressure, an inventive gardener, an engineer named Joseph Paxton, presented an extraordinary idea. Paxton had designed massive greenhouses for the Duke of Devonshire, using prefabricated glass panes and lightweight cast iron frames. His structures were not traditional architecture. They were industrial systems. They could be assembled rapidly, taking advantage of mass-produced identical components. Paxton scaled up his greenhouse concept to an unimaginable size. His proposed building would be 1,848 feet long, 408 feet wide, and 110 feet high. It would use over 300,000 panes of glass, an engineering feat never attempted. The design looked like a giant palace made entirely of glass, transparent walls, iron ribs, sunlight everywhere. Newspapers later called it the Crystal Palace. At first, critics mocked the plan, calling it ridiculous and fragile. They imagined storms ripping through the glass sheets, killing thousands. But Paxton used mathematics, precise iron engineering, and logical materials to prove the building's safety. He argued that industrial architecture should reflect industrial society. Fast, efficient, economical, and democratic. His palace would be a temple celebrating machinery and transparency, an architectural metaphor for a world moving beyond darkness into modernity. The Royal Commission approved his design in July 1850, giving the project just 9 months for completion. The location chosen was Hyde Park, a vast and prestigious open space near the heart of London. The decision triggered immediate controversy. Some complained the project would ruin the natural beauty of the park. Others feared foreign visitors would bring disease or revolution. Landowners worried that crowds would vandalize nearby property, but supporters insisted the park symbolized public freedom. The exhibition would be accessible to all classes, not just aristocracy. For the first time, industrial workers, scientists, and international guests could share the same cultural space. Social mixing was a radical concept in Victorian Britain, where class divisions shaped every corner of society. Construction began in late 1850. Thousands of workers labored day and night, assembling iron beams and attaching glass panes with military precision. Because pieces were prefabricated, the building rose with astonishing speed. Workers called it a machine made of machines. Londoners watched in disbelief as the glass walls reflected sunlight like enormous mirrors. Horses pulling glass wagons became a familiar sight. Newspapers printed weekly updates. Crowds formed daily to marvel at progress. As the Crystal Palace neared completion, British citizens experienced mixed emotions: pride in industrial might, fear of change, excitement about world cultures, anxiety about foreigners. The building looked alien, modern, and ahead of its time. It represented everything that defined the Victorian world: the Industrial Revolution, scientific optimism, imperial ambition, and cultural diversity. By spring 1851, anticipation reached a boiling point. Rumors spread of fantastic inventions waiting inside: steam printing presses, telegraphs, hydraulic machines, new fabrics, precision tools, global art, colonial treasures, agricultural breakthroughs, locomotives, and luxury objects gathered from every continent. The world was about to enter a new age where architecture and technology expressed the deepest dreams of future civilization. And the Crystal Palace stood ready, an iron and glass cathedral dedicated not to religion, but to human ingenuity. The opening of the Great Exhibition on May 1st, 1851, transformed London into the world's capital. From early morning, crowds flooded every road to Hyde Park. Workers in rough coats, wealthy aristocrats in shining carriages, foreign diplomats in elaborate uniforms, and families eager to witness history. London's fog-filled air shimmered with spring sunlight, reflecting off the enormous glass walls. Inside the Crystal Palace, over 100,000 objects were arranged in galleries representing nations, sciences, and arts. It was more than an exhibition. It was a crossroads of civilizations. Queen Victoria, dressed in white satin, opened the ceremony. Behind her stood Prince Albert, whose dream had finally materialized. Military bands played, choirs sang, and patriotic cheers echoed through the structure, vibrating through thousands of panes. The Queen wrote in her diary that the sight filled her with deep emotion, describing the building as fairy-like and majestic. Ordinary visitors agreed. Entering the Crystal Palace was like stepping into another universe. Light poured in from every angle, illuminating trees growing inside the building, fountains spraying upward, and goods glittering from glass cabinets. Some visitors fainted from the overwhelming sensory experience. Others whispered prayers, convinced such a building was a sign of divine progress. For Victorians, science and faith were not enemies. Many believed technology was proof of God's design. But beyond emotion lay hard business. The exhibition aimed to demonstrate Britain's industrial superiority to the world. British machines outnumbered those of any other nation, occupying nearly half the display area. The steam engine exhibits attracted enormous attention. Visitors watched machinery turn raw cotton into finished fabric before their eyes. American exhibits included a reaping machine that impressed European farmers. French displays brought luxury goods, perfumes, jewelry, silk, and furniture, showing finesse more than mechanical strength. India, Ireland, Australia, Canada, and West Indian colonies contributed raw materials and cultural artifacts, reminding visitors of Britain's imperial reach. Tickets were priced to encourage different audiences. Wealthy elites paid high rates for early access, while cheaper tickets allowed working people to visit later. Crowds included women, children, and laborers, groups rarely invited to formal intellectual spaces. The railway system made this fairness possible. Trains transported tens of thousands into London at low cost. The exhibition became a national pilgrimage. People believed they were witnessing the future of civilization. Yet beneath the celebration, critics saw troubling messages. Imperial ideology shaped many exhibits, portraying non-European cultures as primitive and in need of British guidance. Indian jewels and fabrics were displayed as trophies of conquest. African displays often ignored cultural identity and reduced entire societies to exotic curiosities. The exhibition claimed to unite humanity, but also reinforced racial and colonial hierarchies. Many visitors praised the event without questioning this contradiction. Victorian society was proud of empire. Self-reflection was rare. Still, the Great Exhibition inspired countless minds. Charles Darwin visited, observing technological variety with scientific excitement. Writers like Charlotte Bronte and Charles Dickens explored the social meaning of the fair. Philosophers debated whether machines would liberate laborers or destroy human craft traditions. Children left the palace dreaming of becoming inventors. The success of opening day proved that Prince Albert's vision had become real. Over 6 million people would eventually visit. Profits would fund educational institutions, including what later became museums in South Kensington. And the Crystal Palace itself, still shining in the sunlight, represented the birth of a new world. The 19th century was stepping forward into modernity, guided by iron, steam, science, and imagination. The Great Exhibition of 1851 became truly international, not simply because Britain opened its doors to other nations, but because the world itself understood the opportunity hidden behind those glittering glass walls. By the late 1840s, advances in global shipping and communication helped collapse physical distances. Steamships shortened ocean crossings, railroads connected cities with iron arteries, and the electric telegraph, still a relatively new invention, started transmitting news faster than the fastest horse courier ever could. These technologies turned the planet into a more connected environment, and the British government realized that the exhibition could demonstrate London as the beating heart of that developing world network. Official invitations were sent to over 40 countries, and the response stunned organizers. Goods, machines, minerals, fabrics, cultural treasures, and scientific tools traveled from Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Australia, and the Americas, arriving at London docks like a river of global identity. For the first time in history, nations were not meeting to declare war, negotiate borders, or sign treaties. They were meeting to celebrate the peaceful achievements of human labor. This message felt profoundly new in a century still shaped by Napoleonic memory and constant colonial battles. Newspapers called the exhibition a global handshake, a pause in bloodshed, a sign that humanity might finally grow wiser. That sentiment may sound idealistic, but for millions who had lived through famine, revolution, and poverty, hope mattered. The journalists of the time repeatedly insisted that science might unify what politics divided. Prince Albert himself believed that if people could look at the inventions and skills of foreign cultures with admiration, a sense of kinship could replace xenophobic fear. Of course, this harmonious dream existed alongside deeper currents of competition. Countries understood that industrial power defined 19th century identity. Germany hoped to rival British machinery. France intended to prove its artistic superiority. The United States aimed to demonstrate agricultural innovation. Smaller nations, many suffering under imperial pressures, arrived with objects meant to show dignity and ancient wisdom. Nations that had recently modernized, like Russia and some Italian states, used the exhibition to signal their stability and ambition. In this sense, the Crystal Palace served as a silent courtroom where the world judged each other's progress. Yet, the competition felt constructive. Rival inventors borrowed each other's ideas. Patent arrangements were negotiated peacefully, and skilled craftsmen shared techniques across language barriers. The exhibition helped plant the idea that creative knowledge should circulate globally rather than remain locked in one nation. Visitors walking through the glass aisles encountered a dazzling tapestry of cultures. French silk glowing with metallic color, Indian textiles woven with centuries of tradition, Italian sculpture standing beside American agricultural machinery, and West African woodwork displaying artistic power unknown to many Europeans. The palace became an encyclopedia of humanity, organized into visible form. It challenged visitors to understand the world as interconnected rather than distant. Even those who resisted imperial ideology could see that objects spoke across borders. A tool invented in Scotland might improve farming in New Zealand. A dye from Mexico could inspire British textile color. A musical instrument from India might influence European symphonies. Such exchanges slowly reshaped cultural imagination. The exhibition was not simply a display. It was a crossroads, a cultural fusion chamber. Among the most fascinating aspects of global participation were the colonial and semi-colonial contributions. In Victorian Britain, empire was both a source of pride and justification for expansion. Many objects displayed from colonies expressed wealth and exotic resources rather than indigenous autonomy. Indian exhibits drew enormous attention, not merely for jewels and fabrics, but because India symbolized the jewel of British imperial authority. Visitors were astonished by cashmere shawls, intricate metalwork, carved ivory, hand-dyed textiles, and astronomical instruments. Yet Indian craftspeople did not arrive as equals. Many worked under systems controlled by the East India Company, meaning that colonial power shaped how their art was interpreted. To British audiences, these goods often reinforced the belief that empire brought civilization to non-industrial cultures. Even though Indian mathematics, science, architecture, and trade networks had been advanced for centuries before British arrival. Such contradictions were rarely discussed in newspapers. Ireland also contributed a significant collection, showing lace, linen, wood carving, and agricultural products. But unlike India, Ireland was geographically closer and politically volatile. The Great Famine had ended only a few years earlier, leaving deep sorrow. Irish displays at the exhibition served as both cultural celebration and subtle plea for recognition. They revealed that creative excellence could survive catastrophe. Visitors praised Irish craftsmanship's delicacy and emotional richness. Yet the island was under British rule, and the exhibition did nothing to address structural suffering. Still, the fact that Irish artisans stood beside French jewelers and American inventors offered symbolic inclusion into a global stage, encouraging pride and cultural preservation. African contributions arrived in more limited form, often filtered through colonial collectors rather than direct representation. Still, carved sculptures, gold dust, textiles, musical instruments, and agricultural goods from West African regions awakened curiosity in visitors who rarely encountered African art beyond sensational stereotypes. Although displayed through imperial frameworks, these objects quietly told stories of continents with rich cultural identity. Some British scholars, encountering African craftsmanship firsthand, began questioning racist assumptions. That small shift represented the earliest seeds of anthropological respect, though it remained fragile. Meanwhile, the United States used the exhibition to demonstrate a rising industrial confidence. Visitors witnessed ingenious American tools, a reaping machine that revolutionized grain harvest, mass-produced firearms with interchangeable parts, and labor-saving devices that suggested a future defined by agricultural efficiency. Many Europeans viewed American technology with surprise. They had expected a young republic to lag behind older nations. Instead, the United States revealed that innovation did not require aristocracy. It required imagination and accessible education. American inventions helped change the world's belief about who could lead industrial progress. France, Britain's traditional rival, arrived with an entirely different philosophy. French displays emphasized artistic excellence, style, elegance, and luxury. Their jeweled clocks, perfumes, porcelain, and tapestries told a story. Beauty was a form of national identity. British critics sometimes mocked France for lacking machinery, but visitors admired French aesthetics, proving that art shaped national prestige just as much as science did. The Crystal Palace did not simply rank nations by output. It exposed differing cultural values. As the exhibition halls filled, languages mixed in the air: German, Hindi, French, Arabic, Italian, English, and many more. Translators guided guests, while artists sketched foreign visitors with fascination. Hyde Park became a microcosm of global society. People traded postcards, objects, and dreams. The feeling of witnessing something bigger than any single country electrified the crowds. For the first time, the idea of world culture became not an abstraction, but a living experience reflected in glass. The scale of international participation also transformed how nations viewed diplomacy. Prior to 1851, diplomacy had been deeply secretive. Elite ambassadors negotiated in royal courts. Agreements were written behind closed doors, and common people remained unaware of global politics. The exhibition altered this pattern by inviting everyday citizens to experience foreign nations directly. When visitors met French craftsmen or American engineers, they saw real individuals rather than mythical national enemies. Such personal encounters broke prejudice more effectively than newspaper speeches or political arguments ever could. Through shared admiration of a machine or a piece of art, strangers formed human bonds. These encounters also reshaped economic imagination. Merchants attending the exhibition discovered new markets. A British toolmaker might meet an Italian buyer who ordered equipment for factories in Milan. A French textile producer could identify new dyes from India to transform fashion. American farmers learned about British seed varieties and fertilizer chemistry. The exhibition essentially functioned as a global trade summit long before the term existed. It fostered cross-continental supply chains, stimulated shipping routes, and accelerated the global exchange of raw materials and manufactured products. It helped transform capitalism from national to worldwide scale. Even small workshops gained international customers. The exhibition democratized trade in slow, quiet ways that echoed for decades. Another cultural shift emerged: the development of internationalism as moral philosophy. Philosophers and reformers attending the Crystal Palace argued that global exhibitions could reduce war by replacing violent rivalry with industrial comparison. If nations competed with machines, not armies, humanity might grow more peaceful. Prince Albert's speeches repeatedly stressed this dream. Though idealistic, his language influenced intellectual circles. In the decades following 1851, organizations dedicated to international cooperation emerged, including scientific networks, postal unions, and academic societies. The exhibition indirectly fertilized these visions by proving people enjoyed peaceful global gatherings. However, this period also revealed tensions hidden beneath the celebration. Many British working-class visitors felt astonished by the wealth surrounding them, but some reacted with frustration, questioning why industrial profits enriched factory owners while workers struggled. The exhibition showcased machines that replaced skilled labor, provoking fear among artisans. Trade unions worried that mechanization would erase traditional crafts. Newspapers printed debates on whether machinery represented liberation or exploitation. These anxieties formed part of the exhibition's legacy. Technological progress carried both promise and threat. The presence of women inside the Crystal Palace marked another cultural transformation. Victorian society restricted women from academic and political institutions, yet here they walked freely through scientific galleries, examined machines, and studied international cultures. Many women wrote diary entries describing empowerment, and some later became reformers advocating for women's education. The exhibition unexpectedly nurtured early feminist momentum simply by letting women witness knowledge. Crowds continued growing. Railways offered special exhibition fairs. Inns overflowed. Restaurants invented new menus. Shops created souvenirs. And London newspapers printed bilingual editions. The city transformed into a temporary world capital. For many visitors, it was their first time leaving their hometown. For others, their first time seeing art outside a church or museum. For everyone, the Crystal Palace offered a glimpse of humanity expanding beyond borders, guided by invention and imagination. To understand the deeper cultural power of the Great Exhibition, we must step into the lived experience of a typical visitor wandering through the Crystal Palace in the summer of 1851. Newspapers of the period, personal diaries, letters, and surviving guidebooks describe the exhibition interior not simply as architectural wonder, but as a living world of sound, movement, color, and emotion. For working-class visitors who traveled by train from distant towns, the journey itself felt like a pilgrimage. People often rose before dawn, walked miles to railway stations, and boarded crowded carriages filled with excitement and nervous conversation. Upon arrival in London, they confronted a city that seemed impossibly huge, smoky, noisy, filled with strangers speaking unfamiliar languages. But nothing prepared them for the palace itself. The structure towered above the treetops of Hyde Park like a magic ship made of glass. Those entering through the great doors immediately felt disoriented. The interior stretched on, with iron columns disappearing into a horizon of glass. Visitors were asked to purchase guidebooks, which served as maps and educational companions, though many ignored them, overwhelmed by the spectacle. The first impression was light. Sunlight flooded the palace, refracting through hundreds of thousands of panes, creating dazzling reflections on every surface. Some people reported headaches from the brightness, while others described feeling as if they had entered a celestial temple. Trees planted inside, the building rose between iron arches, softening the metallic landscape and reminding everyone that nature and machinery might coexist peacefully. Sounds filled the space constantly. Machinery hummed and clanked. Steam valves hissed. Printing presses rattled. Musical instruments performed demonstrations, and conversation echoed everywhere, multiplied by glass acoustics. The presence of so many languages, French, German, Italian, Hindi, Arabic, Dutch, Russian, and countless regional dialects of Britain, made the palace feel like a global market rather than a national event. Children pointed at objects, tugging at their parents' sleeves, laughing with delight. Women wearing heavy Victorian skirts struggled to move through dense crowds, yet refused to turn back, determined to see every invention possible. Some recorded that the palace felt liberating because it allowed them to walk without a chaperone or male escort in certain areas, an unusual freedom in that era. The sheer variety of exhibits made it impossible to absorb everything in a single day. Visitors could explore scientific instruments, microscopes, telescopes, barometers, and marvel at their intricate parts. They encountered chemical displays explaining new dyes and pigments, transforming how industries imagine color. A section dedicated to timekeeping revealed beautifully engineered clocks, some with tiny mechanical birds that chirped on the hour. Other rooms displayed hydraulic technology capable of moving heavy materials with astonishing force. For many, the sight of a steam engine running inside the palace was unforgettable. They watched iron pistons rise and fall like beating hearts, powering belts and gears that drove industrial looms. Seeing cloth appear from raw cotton seemed like magic. Most emotional of all were the cultural objects representing distant societies. British visitors, many who had never traveled beyond their village, encountered carved African stools, Chinese porcelain, Indian jewels, Turkish carpets, and Japanese lacquerware. They studied patterns, shapes, and colors unknown in Western design traditions. The palace widened minds. While the imperial framework often distorted how these objects were interpreted, the presence of global art nonetheless gave spectators a more complex view of the world. Admissions pricing influenced daily life inside the exhibition. Mondays and Fridays were cheaper days to attract working people. Saturdays and holidays became extremely crowded, and special reserved days allowed wealthy elites to tour the palace with comfort and privacy. The mixing of social classes shocked some aristocrats, who wrote angry letters to newspapers describing discomfort at standing beside factory workers. Yet many Victorians saw this mixture as thrilling, proof that science and art belong to everyone. The Crystal Palace became a rare cultural equalizer in a society obsessed with hierarchy. Food stalls and refreshment rooms added another dimension to the experience. Visitors bought pastries, cold meats, tea, and lemonade. The act of dining among machines and artworks felt symbolic, the merging of ordinary life and advanced technology. Sightseers carried souvenir medals home and displayed them like trophies. Children collected illustrated exhibition cards. Bookstores sold poems inspired by the palace. London turned into a tourist economy, shaping future concepts of mass travel. Through these details, one understands that the Great Exhibition was not merely a national celebration or industrial museum. It was a living environment, a sensory journey through modern identity, shaping how ordinary humans understood progress and themselves. A notable aspect of daily life within the Crystal Palace was the strict system of organization and classification. Victorian society believed in ordering the world through categories and labels. Exhibits were divided into 4 major sections: raw materials, machines, manufactured goods, and fine arts. Each category revealed a philosophical statement: humanity's mastery over nature, raw materials, the transformation of energy, machines, the application of creativity, manufactured goods, and the expression of spirit, fine arts. This structure turned the building into a symbolic universe. People wandering through the palace could sense a narrative arc, beginning with the resources of Earth, moving through technological transformation, reaching aesthetic expression, and finally touching cultural identity. Workers inside the palace wore uniforms to maintain order. Guides were trained to answer questions about engines, fabrics, geological specimens, and artistic styles. They became intermediaries between invention and public understanding. Many visitors approached these workers nervously, unsure whether ordinary people were allowed to ask scientific questions. But guides often spoke kindly, encouraging curiosity. Their presence helped dismantle barriers between experts and amateurs. Scientific knowledge, once reserved for universities and aristocratic salons, spilled into the public domain. Within the gallery of machines, demonstrations occurred at scheduled intervals. Crowds rushed to secure space near the American reaping machine, which promised agricultural revolution. Farmers from rural Britain imagined transforming production, reducing backbreaking labor, and feeding more people with less effort. Textile workers watched power looms tear through fabric faster than the most skilled artisan hand. This sight generated mixed emotions, admiration and fear. Skilled weavers' new machines might replace them. Diaries record bitterness from some laborers who felt the palace celebrated inventions that pushed families into poverty by eliminating traditional crafts. Others saw opportunity. Machines meant new jobs in factories, new demand for coal, iron, engineering, transportation, and commerce. The Industrial Revolution did not simply replace labor, it reshaped it. The Crystal Palace made that transformation visible and undeniable. The fine arts galleries offered relief from machine noise. Visitors entered a quieter, cathedral-like space filled with sculptures and paintings from around the world. Marble figures stood in dramatic poses, reflecting classical mythology and religious devotion. The presence of art inside the exhibition symbolized the Victorian conviction that progress required moral and aesthetic guidance. Britain feared a future driven only by machinery, without beauty or ethics. Paintings from Italy and France mesmerized crowds, as did historic tapestries and delicate glass artwork. Art critics debated whether industrial manufacturing degraded creativity. Could mass-produced goods ever hold the same spirit as handcrafted originals? The exhibition never settled this argument. Instead, it invited people to think deeply about the nature of value. Many visitors recorded shock at how enormous the palace felt. Some walked for hours and still missed entire wings. There was emotional exhaustion, eyes dazzled, legs aching, heads spinning from information. Medical journals reported cases of exhibition fatigue, describing dizziness, faintness, and sensory overload. And yet, no one regretted attending. For people living in cramped homes, dark alleyways, or polluted factory districts, the palace represented fresh air, light, possibility, and space. Standing beneath its glass ceilings, they felt important, part of something global. Education groups visited regularly. Schools organized trips. Universities held tours for students. Scientists used the palace as open classroom. Children observed fossils, minerals, insects, and botanical samples. They peered into microscopes and gasped at unknown worlds. The exhibition inspired new generations to pursue careers in science. These young minds would later build the late 19th century's advances: electrical systems, telephones, automobiles, and early flight. Thus, daily life inside the palace was not passive viewing. It was intellectual awakening. Each display changed how people thought. Each invention rewired imagination. Each cultural encounter reshaped identity. In modern terms, the Crystal Palace functioned like the world's first immersive learning environment. Part museum, part university, part festival, and part economic marketplace. Its atmosphere revealed that industrial progress and cultural curiosity could coexist, feeding a future where knowledge belonged to everyone rather than the privileged few. While crowds filled the glass corridors, social rituals and human drama unfolded quietly in the background, moments rarely documented in official histories. Letters from middle-class visitors describe awkward encounters with aristocrats who disliked walking among mechanics, and factory hands. Yet these confrontations also symbolized changing Victorian attitudes. Industrial wealth was rising. Old hereditary privilege felt threatened. Many aristocrats feared that showcasing machinery empowered the very class that demanded political reform. Some newspapers warned that too much exposure to global cultures might weaken British values. But these warnings did little to diminish public enthusiasm. The palace itself produced a sense of spectacle that encouraged romance and adventure. Young couples met while discussing artwork or peering into mirrors made from foreign crystal. Writers later described the palace as a place where love stories began. Artists set up easels to sketch visitors, selling portraits as souvenirs. Entrepreneurs hawked pamphlets, candies, and trinkets near entrances, building a small carnival economy. Police patrolled constantly, watching for pickpockets, but serious crime remained rare. The exhibition produced a mood of idealism and mutual respect. Religious leaders debated whether the palace threatened spirituality. Some clergy argued that worship of technology resembled idolatry. Others praised the exhibition as proof of God's gift of intelligence. Sermons drew parallels between Genesis and invention, declaring that humanity fulfilled divine purpose by reshaping the world. Churches organized trips to the palace to inspire faith in progress. The blending of religion and science reflected the unique psychology of Victorian Britain. Confidence in God, trust in industry, fear of moral collapse, and hunger for improvement. Even the weather influenced the palace experience. When sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, the interior sparkled with heavenly radiance. But on cloudy days, reflections dimmed, and the palace felt colder, more industrial. Rain drumming on the panes produced ghostly echoes. Winter evenings created misty light patterns that astonished visitors. No traditional building could replicate these atmospheres. The palace was alive with sky and season. At the emotional core of daily life was the idea of belonging. Rural farmers, factory workers, seamstresses, blacksmiths, teachers, and miners entered the palace and temporarily shed the identity of class. They became citizens of the modern world. Their diaries repeatedly describe a single powerful phrase: "I felt part of something greater than myself." That emotional transformation mattered. It shaped politics, art, literature, and education in the decades that followed. The exhibition broadened national consciousness, proving that ordinary people deserved access to the wonders of human knowledge. For travelers from outside London, the palace became story material for generations. Grandparents described their journeys to children who never saw it. Local newspapers retold memories of invention and beauty. Teachers used the exhibition to inspire school lessons. Villages far from industrial centers gained pride as residents shared souvenirs and memories. The palace united Britain not only physically, but imaginatively. Ultimately, daily life in the Crystal Palace demonstrated that the Great Exhibition was not a static archive of objects. It was a human experience, messy, emotional, sensory, confusing, joyful, frightening, transformative. People felt awe, envy, fear, excitement, exhaustion, and hope. They saw machines that challenged their futures and art that connected to their pasts. They shared space with strangers from distant lands. They questioned old beliefs and formed new ones. In this way, the exhibition became more than an event. It became a cultural mirror reflecting the complexities of a world entering modernity. The Great Exhibition of 1851 not only displayed objects, it revealed the identity of a nation undergoing extreme transformation. The Britain that built the Crystal Palace was not merely wealthy. It was uncertain, ambitious, divided, confident, anxious, and deeply self-aware. For decades leading up to 1851, newspapers, writers, engineers, and politicians debated what Britain had become and what it still needed to be. The Industrial Revolution produced enormous factories, booming cities, and global shipping routes, yet also produced harsh conditions for working families. The smoke that powered industry also blackened homes, contaminated rivers, and poisoned lungs. Child labor remained common in textile mills, and slum overcrowding created disease and crime. Yet in the minds of most Victorians, these sacrifices seemed necessary to maintain Britain's role as the workshop of the world. Inside the Crystal Palace, this identity was put on display. If you walked through the British machinery section, you could not escape the patriotic story the objects were telling. That steam, iron, and coal had built an empire more powerful than any before. Steam locomotives, mining drills, textile engines, and printing presses stood like iron monuments to industrial triumph. Their polished brass and steel reflected torchlight and sunlight, suggesting purity and progress rather than dirt and fatigue. To many observers, these machines were more than tools. They were national heroes. Engineers who designed them were celebrated like generals who won battles, and visitors spoke with reverence about Britain's technological destiny. But the palace also stirred uncomfortable emotions. Visitors from rural regions who still practiced manual crafts suddenly saw their future collapse. Their skills, once respected, now appeared outdated next to mechanized production. A farmer who spent weeks harvesting grain with sickles watched an American reaping machine do the same work in minutes. A weaver who spent years perfecting textile patterns saw factory looms mass-produce cloth with mechanical precision. The palace did not just show progress, it exposed social fragility. Britain was in transition from hand labor to mechanized labor, from artisan to industrial worker. Educated Victorians believed this transition would create a more enlightened society. They thought machines would reduce toil, expand leisure, and raise living standards. They also believed that universal access to knowledge through museums, schools, public libraries, and exhibitions would shape moral citizens. Prince Albert himself hoped the exhibition would uplift the working class intellectually rather than simply entertain them. But skeptics feared that factory machines would erase humanity altogether. Writers like Charles Dickens expressed anxiety that industrialization turned workers into replaceable cogs. Even within the palace, this fear was silently present. Every gear, piston, and belt represented a transformed relationship between human beings and labor. Visitors could sense this duality in the atmosphere. At one moment, they felt national pride from witnessing Britain's dominance in machinery and trade. At another, they felt overwhelmed by questions about inequality, automation, and culture. The palace became a symbolic crossroads where optimism challenged pessimism. It forced the British public to confront what kind of nation they wanted to build. Was the goal simply to dominate world markets, or to improve living conditions at home? Was progress defined only by profit, or also by dignity? Historians later argued that the exhibition helped shape the British working class into a modern identity. By entering a shared national space, workers saw themselves as stakeholders in society. They did not simply observe innovation. They claimed emotional ownership of it. Even those who feared machines still felt inspired by the grandeur of the palace. Industrial progress became part of their identity, even if it threatened their livelihoods. That psychological shift mattered. It created a population willing to participate in democratic reforms, unions, public education movements, and scientific culture. Most importantly, the Crystal Palace encouraged a moral narrative that Britain could lead the world not just with steel and ships, but with culture and knowledge. This idea defined Victorian identity for decades, shaping museums, universities, and global exhibitions that followed. The exhibition also reshaped Britain's internal class relationships. Before 1851, society was sharply divided. Aristocrats saw workers as crude and ignorant, while laborers viewed elites as oppressive and selfish. But inside the glass palace, these groups stood shoulder to shoulder. Shared fascination over inventions created unlikely conversations. A wealthy banker might question a coal miner about engine parts. A factory owner might listen to a teenage girl explain how textile machines change her family's income back home. Although class prejudice did not disappear, it softened through exposure. Some aristocrats complained loudly. They argued that allowing the lower classes to mingle freely in Hyde Park would lead to moral contamination and disorder. They feared pickpockets, riots, and revolutionary agitation like those happening on the continent. Yet these fears were proven false. Crime remained surprisingly low, and crowds behaved with dignity. One newspaper described the palace as a monument to peaceful coexistence, claiming the British working class offered proof that education and access to culture improved moral behavior. Middle-class reformers seized that narrative and used it to argue for new social policies. They petitioned for better schools, sanitation systems, and public lecture programs. They believed the success of the exhibition demonstrated the nation's hunger for knowledge. Women's education advocates used the palace as evidence that women belonged in intellectual spaces. Working-class self-improvement societies, already growing before 1851, expanded rapidly afterward. People saw that studying science, mechanics, geology, and manufacturing could improve their status and influence. The exhibition helped turn learning into a social right rather than a privilege. The palace also affected mental attitudes toward poverty. In the decades before 1851, poor people were often blamed for their condition, accused of laziness or moral weakness. But seeing the working classes behave admirably inside the palace forced some elites to reconsider those assumptions. They witnessed intelligent questions asked by people who had never entered universities. They saw working mothers teaching their children to appreciate art and history. This challenged the stereotype that poverty equaled ignorance. It inspired philanthropists to build museums, libraries, and public parks, institutions that trace spiritual roots to the exhibition. The British press captured these social changes in real time. Articles described not only machinery and international wonder, but also human stories unfolding in the aisles. Fathers explaining physics to daughters, soldiers discussing architecture with merchants, and elderly farmers examining microscopes with tears in their eyes. Those articles spread across the country, turning the Crystal Palace into a national moral symbol. The idea that people from every class could gather peacefully to celebrate knowledge felt revolutionary. Another important transformation concerned consumer psychology. Victorian families visiting the palace started to see household items, not as luxuries, but as attainable elements of modern life. Decorative glass, printed fabrics, metal furniture, and domestic appliances filled British stores after the exhibition because demand exploded. People wanted their homes to reflect the same modern identity they saw in London. Consumption became cultural expression. Although consumerism would later raise ethical concerns, in 1851 it fueled pride, employment, and innovation. Finally, the exhibition broadened the definition of what it meant to be British. Before this event, British identity was strongly regional. Scots, Welsh, English, and Irish communities often defined themselves separately. But standing inside a crystal monument showcasing national success gave the population a unified emotional reference point. They no longer belonged only to their village or county. They belong to an industrial empire shaping the modern world. Without this new nationalism, later political developments, from reforms to imperial diplomacy, would have followed very different paths. The exhibition also played a profound role in shaping Britain's future urban landscape. The enormous number of visitors forced London to modernize rapidly. Streets were widened, public toilets improved, and new methods of crowd management were invented. Hotels adapted to increased tourism, restaurants evolved their menus, and shops learned to market products to international consumers. This created a blueprint for modern metropolitan development. Cities around Europe studied London's success and used it to prepare their own public events. The financial impact on Britain proved enormous. Investors saw global potential in industrial manufacturing and poured money into factories and railroads. The exhibition generated such excitement that industries expanded faster than before. New factories emerged in Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, and Glasgow. These industrial cities enjoyed rapid population growth and urban migration. The wealth generated by exports helped support scientific research, scholarship funds, and the establishment of learning institutions. In this way, the exhibition redistributed national wealth toward cultural infrastructure. Another major outcome was the strengthening of Britain's imperial ideology. Inside the palace, the organization of displays made British industrial goods appear superior to colonial raw materials. Cotton from India or Egypt arrived as unprocessed fiber, while British textile machines transformed those fibers into refined products. This narrative visually reinforced the myth that Britain civilized the world. Although deeply problematic, this idea shaped Victorian politics, foreign policy, and education. Children were taught that Britain carried the responsibility of improving other societies. The exhibition helped turn imperialism into moral justification. But something deeper happened that historians sometimes overlook. The exhibition helped ordinary British people emotionally detach from medieval mindsets and step into a scientific worldview. Spectators who once believed disease was punishment from the heavens now read pamphlets explaining germs, sanitation, and chemistry. Farmers who once relied solely on weather intuition observed agricultural science tools that predicted soil outcomes. Artists who once feared mechanization visited galleries showing that creativity could coexist with technology. The palace weakened superstition not by rejecting faith, but by offering knowledge powerful enough to reduce fear. Not all reactions were positive. Satirical writers mocked the palace as a glass monster, accusing it of worshiping industry at the expense of human soul. Poets wrote that machines enslaved society, replacing art with noise. Some philosophers argued that the obsession with innovation masked moral emptiness. These criticisms were important. They balanced blind optimism with caution. They prevented industrial propaganda from going unchallenged. In later decades, these voices influenced policies that protected workers, preserved crafts, and critiqued global capitalism. Meanwhile, British universities sent scholars into the palace to study visitor behavior. They wanted to understand how people learned, what captured their attention, and how space influenced understanding. Their findings shaped museum architecture for the next century. Exhibitions became more interactive, more educational, and more accessible. Galleries were designed with open sight lines, wide walkways, and structured narrative sequences. The palace served as a living laboratory of pedagogy. Most significant of all, the exhibition helped Britain transition psychologically into the modern age. It provided emotional proof that change could be beautiful rather than terrifying. Standing beneath a roof of science and light, people glimpsed a future in which knowledge connected nations, creativity shaped identity, and progress serve humanity. Even if reality never fully matched the dream itself reshaped society. In this sense, the Crystal Palace was not merely a building, it was a cultural awakening. The Crystal Palace was more than a building. It was a breakthrough in engineering philosophy that transformed how Victorians thought about space, materials, labor, and aesthetic purpose. To truly appreciate its long-lasting influence, one must begin with the engineering mindset behind Joseph Paxton's design. Paxton was not a traditional architect. He came from a gardening background and had built massive greenhouses at Chatsworth using modular cast iron frames and glass panels. That experience gave him something most architects lacked: practical knowledge of how light, humidity, weight, and temperature interacted in structures made primarily of glass. What he proposed for the Great Exhibition was a structure of breathtaking simplicity, a building that relied on standardized parts manufactured off-site and assembled rapidly on location. At the time, architectural practice still revolved around stone, wood, brick, carpentry traditions, and painstaking craftsmanship. Paxton rejected all of that. His design treated architecture as industrial product. Iron columns were identical, beams interchangeable, glass cut in regular sizes. The entire palace was effectively one massive kit. This idea completely revolutionized building logic. In the 19th century, construction typically involved hand-tailoring each stone block and shaping each wooden beam. But the Crystal Palace proved that architecture could be assembled rather than sculpted. Many historians argue that Paxton unintentionally invented the modern factory building and even foreshadowed skyscraper construction. His modular framing allowed incredibly fast progress. The palace was erected in just a few months, despite its enormous scale. Engineers recorded precise measurements and logistical data. By winter of 1850, iron components were being cast in Midlands factories and shipped to London by railway. Workers followed standardized assembly patterns. Bolt this beam here, align this pane there, like industrial choreography. The building rose so quickly that foreign observers accused Britain of exaggeration until they saw it themselves. The palace stretched nearly 1,850 feet in length, longer than 4 modern football fields lined end to end. Its central transept towered 110 feet above the ground, creating a breathtaking vaulted space capable of housing full-grown elm trees that already existed in Hyde Park. Instead of cutting the trees down, Paxton designed the roof around them, a symbolic gesture that united nature and industry. Victorians marveled at this fusion. They did not see nature being conquered. Instead, they saw evidence that technology could adapt to the natural world without destroying it. Inside, visitors experienced continuous space unlike anything they had ever known. Traditional buildings broke interior environments into rooms and corridors, but the palace produced a sweeping horizon of iron and glass with few solid walls. This created remarkable sight lines. A person entering from one side could see the silhouettes of galleries and arches stretching to distant vanishing points. The effect was overwhelming, like standing inside a man-made canyon of light. Newspapers described the interior as endless, oceanic, and dreamlike. Some visitors said the building felt alive, breathing, changing color throughout the day as sunlight shifted. The Crystal Palace proved that architecture could engage human emotions through transparency, openness, and immensity rather than weight and mass. The building also solved a practical problem: ventilation. Victorian London was suffocating under coal smoke, and crowds packed into closed spaces risked fainting from stale air. Paxton's structure used a complex system of louvers and openings that allowed warm air to rise and escape through roof vents. Glass panes were arranged to create upward drafts. As a result, The interior remained surprisingly comfortable even with thousands of bodies inside. Without such engineering insight, the exhibition might have become a medical disaster. Instead, journalists praised the palace as hygienic and refreshing. Critics, however, argued that a temporary iron building was inferior to stone monuments like St. Paul's Cathedral. They feared the glass palace lacked dignity and permanence. Iron was still unfamiliar as architectural primary material, and many believed glass made the building fragile. They were proven wrong. During powerful storms before the opening, the structure remained unshaken. Scientific testing showed the palace could withstand high winds due to its flexible frame. Instead of resisting pressure through mass, it diffused force through distributed support, a concept now standard in earthquake-resistant design. Thus, the Crystal Palace represented nothing less than architectural revolution. It introduced new ideas: prefabrication, modularity, transparency, mass production, structural lightness, industrial labor organization, and environmental integration. These principles shaped 20th century architecture, from train stations and exhibition halls to airports and modern skyscrapers. The building became a living metaphor for a future where technology would change not just industry, but also the way people lived, worked, and dreamed. Beyond engineering, the Crystal Palace signaled a cultural shift in design values. Traditionally, architecture emphasized ornamentation and historical imitation. Gothic arches, Renaissance domes, Baroque embellishments, and neoclassical columns. These styles communicated power through grandeur. But Paxton introduced an architectural language rooted in efficiency and honesty. His building openly expressed the materials it was made from. The iron frame was not hidden behind stone facades, and glass was left unpainted. Form followed function, decades before modernist theorists coined the phrase. This honesty shocked Victorian audiences. Some critics accused Paxton of stripping architecture of beauty. They argued that a building should reflect national spirit with decoration, mythological symbolism, and historical reference. To them, a clear glass structure looked unfinished, almost industrially naked. Yet younger intellectuals celebrated the palace for rejecting imitation and embracing originality. For them, the Crystal Palace symbolized a world finally ready to leave medieval romanticism behind and embrace scientific truth. When sunlight entered the palace, colors of exhibits blended with reflected rays, creating constantly shifting aesthetics. No 2 minutes looked the same. That dynamic quality suggested that architecture could be kinetic and alive rather than fixed in stone. Inside the palace, objects were arranged to highlight spatial flow. Mechanical displays, sculptures, furniture, fabrics, and musical instruments all interacted through visual harmony. This interior planning helped transform exhibitions into educational experiences instead of chaotic markets. Visitors learned to follow narrative pathways, raw material to finished product, ancient art to modern craft, national identity to global exchange. The use of cast iron also altered architectural labor. Skilled stonemasons, previously central to large building projects, now found themselves replaced by factory-made components. This disruption fueled debates. Was industrial construction degrading craftsmanship or democratizing it? Supporters believed modular architecture allowed faster growth of cities at lower cost, decreasing housing scarcity. Opponents worried the world was becoming soulless. That argument continues today in urban design philosophy, between handcrafted individuality and mass-produced efficiency. Another key innovation was water management. Rain striking the huge glass roof had to be drained without producing noise or leaks. Engineers created integrated gutter systems hidden within structural ribs, technology still used in large commercial buildings today. Heating was likewise ahead of its time. though the palace did not require artificial heat during summer exhibition months. Paxton's greenhouse knowledge ensured that trapped solar energy warmed interior spaces without excessive temperature rise. The palace even shaped environmental psychology. Visitors accustomed to dark, wooden interiors were shocked by the openness. Being surrounded by glass changed how they moved and behaved. They walked upright, spoke softly, and described feeling purified by light. The transparency removed psychological boundaries. People felt they were part of a shared cultural moment. Many metaphorically compared the palace to a cathedral of progress. The design also contributed to democratization. Because materials were inexpensive, politicians realized similar structures could be built for schools, libraries, and public institutions. Architects used Paxton's methods to create train stations and shopping arcades. Entire fields of industrial design, furniture standardization, display cases, shelving, originated from exhibition practicality. Later, when the palace was relocated to Sydenham in 1854, its architecture influenced world culture again. The redesigned structure included new wings, courts showcasing world civilizations, and expanded glass spaces visible from miles away. Although it tragically burned in 1936, its conceptual legacy remains powerful. Architects traced a direct lineage from Paxton's modular design to railway sheds, Eiffel Tower engineering logic, Chicago school steel frames, and even modern megastructures made of steel and glass. In short, the Crystal Palace was not a decorative experiment. It was a philosophical redefinition of what buildings could be. It merged science and art, efficiency and beauty, industry and imagination. Its architectural principles resonate through every airport terminal, shopping mall atrium, greenhouse conservatory, and exhibition pavilion built since. Few structures in history created an intellectual shift as profound. Perhaps the most striking cultural impact of the Crystal Palace was its symbolic role as a monument to human progress. Victorian people saw it not merely as a technological achievement, but as a physical expression of optimism. Its transparency represented moral clarity. Its modernity embodied national destiny. Its scale projected confidence. And its international inclusivity suggested a peaceful future shaped through cooperation rather than war. Before 1851, iconic architecture belonged mostly to religion and monarchy, cathedrals, palaces, castles. These buildings communicated tradition, hierarchy, and divine authority. The Crystal Palace disrupted that value system. It said that technology, ordinary workers, inventors, engineers, and merchants deserved monumental space. That idea transformed cultural identity. It shifted admiration from kings to creators, from aristocrats to industrial thinkers. The palace functioned as a democracy of achievement. People walked beneath arches knowing the building was the result of collaborative labor, not aristocratic decree. This emotional shift cannot be overstated. Millions felt personal pride seeing the palace, even if they had never touched iron or glass in their lives. They believed they lived in the most advanced age known to humanity. Newspapers reported that visitors often stood silently staring upward, their expressions filled with awe. Diaries describe emotional tears. The experience convinced many that the future would be brighter than the past. Meanwhile, engineers across Europe wrote letters expressing astonishment. They recognized the palace as proof that architecture could embrace industrial science without sacrificing beauty. French scholars praised its elegance. German engineers studied its modular assembly for future factories and train stations. American designers later used its logic to develop world's fairs, skyscraper frames, and department stores. We must also consider the philosophical implications. the Crystal Palace challenged the very purpose of architecture. It raised questions such as, should buildings inspire awe or simply serve function? Can transparency replace ornamentation? Does architecture shape human behavior by controlling space and light? Victorian intellectuals debated these questions in essays, university lectures, and political speeches. The palace encouraged society to think critically about city planning, worker housing, and public space. It suggested that environments should encourage openness rather than secrecy. The structure even influenced literature. Writers described the palace as utopian, dystopian, dreamlike, terrifying, or divine. Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky later referenced it symbolically as a metaphor for rationalism overwhelming human emotion. British poets praised its shimmer while warning that perfect geometry could erase individuality. These responses proved the building had psychological power beyond its architectural purpose. When the Crystal Palace was relocated to Sydenham, it continued shaping British identity through educational courts that displayed Assyrian, Egyptian, Greco-Roman, and medieval cultures. These exhibits helped form modern concepts of world history, archaeology, and comparative civilization. School children walked through reconstructions of ancient temples, absorbing knowledge through spectacle. In a way, the palace gave birth to museum culture as we know it. Tragically, the Crystal Palace was destroyed by fire in 1936. Flames consumed the glass giant overnight. People awake in London saw the sky glowing orange and heard the massive frame collapse. The destruction devastated national memory. Newspapers mourned the loss as if a beloved figure had died. Yet the legacy survived in imagination. Architects, writers, historians, and engineers continued discussing the Crystal Palace not as ruins, but as inspiration. To this day, when people enter modern steel glass airports or towering atriums flooded with light, they unknowingly walk through Paxton's intellectual lineage. The Crystal Palace remains a symbol of human capacity to dream beyond tradition, embrace the unknown, and shape technology into beauty. It stands in history as proof that architecture can speak, teach, inspire, and change the world. Not through stone permanence, but through vision. To understand the great exhibition's intellectual importance, we must examine how it reshaped Victorian science and public thinking about discovery. Before 1851, scientific research existed largely inside universities, private laboratories, aristocratic societies, or exclusive academies. Scientific language was intimidating, publications expensive, and experiments difficult to observe. A distance existed between scientists and the general population. Newspapers often published sensationalized summaries of discoveries rather than explanations rooted in evidence. At the exhibition, that barrier collapsed. Science stepped out of closed lecture halls and into the Crystal Palace where anyone, child, farmer, seamstress, carpenter, aristocrat, could witness tangible proof of how science shaped daily life. The palace contained vast displays dedicated to physics, chemistry, geology, metallurgy, astronomy, optics, printing, and medical invention. Although these fields were not equally represented, the combined effect was astonishing. Spectators saw telegraph systems sending electrical pulses across wire networks. Technology so new that many believe electricity was supernatural energy. They encountered microscopes capable of magnifying cells and insect wings with shocking clarity. People learned that disease came from observable organisms, not mysterious vapors or divine punishment. Seeing microorganisms enlarged under glass altered how visitors thought about health and sanitation. It inspired interest in public hygiene, laying early groundwork for policies that would eventually reduce cholera and typhoid epidemics in London. The exhibition also highlighted chemistry's industrial power. Chemical dyes displayed brilliant colors never seen before in British clothing. Glass manufacturers demonstrated how combinations of silica, lead, and soda produced crystal surfaces of different densities and refraction abilities. Metallurgists explained how altering carbon content shifted iron into steel, knowledge essential for bridges, engines, cannons, and future skyscrapers. Many visitors who once relied on folklore or guesswork in trades such as blacksmithing or farming discovered scientific logic shaping familiar tools. This transformation was not merely intellectual. It became emotional. People began believing science could improve life and reduce suffering. Geology captivated crowds as well. Fossils arranged in chronological sequence revealed Earth's ancient history, challenging literal biblical timelines that many Victorians had previously accepted without question. Rock samples from India, Australia, Scotland, and Canada allowed observers to compare global mineral layers, suggesting a shared planetary structure. For some visitors, these discoveries felt frightening, as if sacred narratives were dissolving into secular truth. Others found the information liberating. The exhibition did not provide final answers, but it enabled a public dialogue between faith and evidence. Astronomy displays carried similar force. Telescopes pointed at models of planets, showing Saturn's rings and lunar craters. Visitors purchased affordable star charts and planetary diagrams. Children dreamed of becoming astronomers. In earlier centuries, only elites could access this kind of learning, but the Crystal Palace redistributed knowledge. It said, "Look, science belongs to you." One must also consider the psychological effect. Before 1851, people often viewed inventors as eccentric loners. After the exhibition, inventors were celebrated as heroic visionaries. Newspapers told thrilling stories about telegraph inventors, shipbuilders, optical lens designers, hydraulic engineers, and steam mechanics. School teachers reported that students who once feared mathematics now found purpose in it. Self-education movements grew rapidly because the exhibition proved knowledge was not sacred treasure locked behind elite doors. It was public resource. The exhibition's scientific ambition reflected Prince Albert's intellectual ideals. He believed technology could unify nations through shared rational thought. His speeches emphasized that science offered peaceful collaboration rather than conflict. He imagined a world in which inventions would reduce war by improving communication and economic cooperation. The exhibition became physical evidence that science was international language. Visitors left the palace changed. Many returned home with books and pamphlets, determined to learn more. They discussed discoveries in pubs, schools, churches, factories, and households. Knowledge flowed into society like electricity through telegraph cables. Every visitor carried insight into the world beyond their village. This democratization of science is one of the exhibition's greatest legacies, though it is often overshadowed by focus on architecture. The palace was a classroom that never slept, and the world learned by walking its aisles. One of the most celebrated scientific marvels of the exhibition was the expanding field of mechanical engineering. Machines were not displayed as static objects. Many functioned in real time. Steam engines hissed, whirred, cranked, and thundered, creating soundscapes that shaped the memory of London. People approached machinery with awe, fear, admiration, or deep concern. Traditional artisans feared machines would erase their trades, but others believed mechanization would liberate humanity from exhausting physical labor. The palace became a philosophical battleground between hope and anxiety. Engineers demonstrated machining lathes cutting precise threads into steel rods. Visitors watched milling devices carve complex shapes that once took hours of hand labor. They observed iron drills capable of boring through thick metal sheets. This was the mechanical age revealing its strength. Metal became malleable, measurable, predictable. Tools gained reproducibility. Precision engineering replaced improvisation. The machine section symbolized a new worldview, that everything in nature could be quantified, standardized, and controlled. Transportation technology drew enormous crowds. Steam locomotives appeared as mechanical giants, representing speed and conquest over geography. Models of railway networks showed lines stretching from London into rural landscapes. Railroads represented social change. New job markets expanded travel, migration, business networks, and national unity. For people living in isolated villages, trains meant connection to opportunity. Maritime engineering also advanced dramatically. Steamships capable of crossing oceans with predictable schedules replaced sailing vessels dependent on wind. Exhibits included propeller systems, hull designs, and navigational instruments such as sextants and compasses. Colonial trade routes would soon depend on these technologies, altering global economics. Another groundbreaking element was printing machinery. Before industrialization, books had been expensive and literacy limited. But automated printing presses at the exhibition demonstrated mass production of newspapers, pamphlets, and books. Seeing printed words stream from machines like flowing rivers astonished visitors. The event deepened demand for literacy because reading became more accessible. Public libraries later expanded because people wanted to read affordable books. Education systems grew partly because the exhibition showed reading could be everyday necessity rather than luxury. The exhibition also revealed a world turning toward automation. Machinist-powered machines. Gear systems transferred force. Belts and pulleys replaced muscle. The factory became ecosystem rather than isolated workshop. Inside the palace, this mechanical ecosystem echoed loudly, forming rhythmic industrial symphony. Visitors reported hearing the buildings pulse long after leaving it. That experience embedded industrial culture into national memory. Scientific instruments captivated intellectuals. Barometers measured atmospheric pressure. Thermometers displayed temperature fluctuations. Spectroscopes analyzed light. These devices represented scientific truth, replacing superstition. They proved nature could be measured, predicted, and understood without divine interpretation. Even clergy who attended the palace could not deny the clarity of data. Many religious thinkers embraced science as extension of God's design. The exhibition helped reduce conflict between science and religion by showing that empirical knowledge strengthened spiritual appreciation rather than destroying faith. Medical science also had presence. Models of human skeletons, preserved organs, prosthetic limbs, and surgical tools revealed growing understanding of anatomy. Artificial limbs displayed engineering artistry that improved lives of wounded soldiers and factory accident victims. Spectators saw how pain might be reduced through invention rather than prayer alone. Public perception of hospitals began to change. Instead of seeing them as dark places of death, people began recognizing them as institutions built on knowledge. The exhibition's machinery section demonstrated that the human body, too, was understood as a mechanical system. Heart pumps, lung bellows, and skeletal frameworks were compared to industrial models. Though crude, these analogies sparked scientific curiosity. They helped inspire later breakthroughs in physiology and biomedical engineering. Overall, the exhibition turned machinery into national mythology. Machines symbolized British identity, strength, intelligence, and destiny. Yet beneath the pride lay important questions. Would machines liberate or enslave? That question remains unresolved even today. The Great Exhibition also acted as laboratory for philosophical debate about innovation. 19th century thinkers wrestled with a profound question. Was human progress limitless? Victorians believed they lived at the peak of history. Many truly thought the world had reached final stages of technological evolution. They imagined nothing could surpass the steam locomotive or telegraph. Yet, paradoxically, the exhibition seeded imagination for inventions not yet conceived. Electric lighting, cinematography, airplanes, automobiles, radios, computers. The palace inspired future inventors. Young visitors who stared at engines later designed turbines, suspension bridges, or wireless communication systems. The exhibition proved invention could be a public career rather than eccentric hobby. Students returned to school with ambition fueled by wonder. For them, innovation felt accessible. They believed knowledge could be learned, applied, and improved. That shift changed global history more than any single artifact displayed in 1851. One overlooked but crucial scientific influence was statistical thinking. Exhibition organizers gathered enormous data about visitor counts, ticket patterns, and crowd movement. They published reports analyzing social behavior using charts and numbers. This approach helped establish modern social science. Policymakers later used exhibition data to plan urban transportation, sanitation, fire regulations, and educational investments. Social measurement became a tool of government rather than academic curiosity. Engineering colleges studied the palace as structural model. Universities created new curriculum emphasizing mechanical drawing, industrial mathematics, metallurgy, and applied physics. Within a generation, engineering emerged as respected professional discipline. Before the exhibition, engineers held low social status, often dismissed as craftsmen. Afterward, they gained authority equivalent to doctors and lawyers. We must also examine intellectual tension surrounding mechanization and creativity. Art critics worried that machines would destroy individuality. If machines produced identical goods, what would happen to uniqueness? Could art survive mass production? The palace did not answer these questions, but by forcing people to confront them, it shaped future thought. In later decades, arts and crafts movements emerged to defend handmade beauty against industrial uniformity. Modernist architecture, too, grew from this tension, embracing simplicity but mourning ornament. Philosophers interpreted the exhibition as symbol of humanity's increasing control over nature. Some believed this mastery justified imperialism. Others warned that humanity might lose humility. Social reformers saw machines as tools to reduce suffering. Factory critics saw them as instruments of exploitation. The palace held both dreams simultaneously. Environmental thought emerged unexpectedly because the palace contained living trees inside industrial glass. Visitors imagined harmony between technology and nature. Some believed cities could become green spaces with glass-covered walkways, gardens, and public domes. This utopian dream later influenced botanical gardens, urban parks, and even future architectural concepts like climate-controlled cities. Perhaps most profoundly, the exhibition encouraged people to question their worldview. Letters from visitors reveal deep reflections. I saw the world in its variety and understood that no nation stands alone. I learned that poverty is not ignorance and wealth is not wisdom. I realized machines are our future, whether we fear or welcome them. These personal insights show that the exhibition succeeded not only in displaying innovation, but in awakening critical thought. Although the Great Exhibition is often celebrated for its technological innovations and machinery, the artistic dimension of the Crystal Palace was equally important. In Victorian society, art was not merely decorative. It was considered moral guidance, scientific evidence, emotional instruction, and historical memory. The palace contained more than 20,000 artistic works, ranging from monumental sculptures to miniature jewelry, from colossal tapestries to delicate glass ornaments, from paintings and architectural models to textiles, porcelain, and woodcraft. These objects did not simply exist as ornaments of beauty, but as visual arguments. They suggested that culture defined national identity, that memory shaped modern meaning, and that creativity could coexist with mechanized modernity rather than vanish under it. For many, the art exhibits proved that machines and minds were not enemies. They could inspire each other. British art dominated certain sections, displaying neoclassical sculptures that imitated ancient Greece and Rome. These statues often represented myths, heroes, and virtues. Victorians believed classical imagery uplifted moral character. Children viewing statues of Roman senators might imagine themselves capable of civic greatness. Adults studying marble figures might reflect on self-discipline or sacrifice. The palace walls held paintings depicting landscapes, cathedrals, battle scenes, portraits, and rural life. These scenes reminded spectators that British identity was rooted in tradition, even as modern industry reshaped the nation. Landscapes in oil paint emphasized calm fields, stone cottages, and peaceful rivers, deliberate contrast to noisy urban centers. Visitors stared at these paintings and felt nostalgia for the countryside they left behind. The exhibition also revealed Britain's growing hunger for artistic education. At the time, museums were expensive and exclusive. Many working-class families had never seen famous paintings or sculptures. Stepping into the fine arts galleries, they encountered beauty on a monumental scale for the first time. Diaries reveal that factory workers often stood silent before marble statues, unable to speak because they felt suddenly connected to history. Seeing art firsthand, rather than reading about it, awakened confidence. People realized they were capable of appreciating complex aesthetics. The exhibition therefore challenged social prejudices that equated education with wealth. Beyond Britain, international art reshaped how visitors imagined foreign cultures. French displays emphasized luxury craftsmanship, perfume bottles, clocks, porcelain, gowns, and mirrors. The elegance stunned British spectators who associated France with romance and refinement. French clockmakers presented intricately enameled watches and timepieces that seemed like glittering jewels rather than functional devices. This reminded Britain that artistry, not just machinery, could define a nation's prestige. France used art as diplomatic weapon. Their displays said, "We lead in beauty," while British machinery shouted, "We lead in industry." Italy's contributions focused on sculpture and music. Marble carvings inspired by Michelangelo and Renaissance masters filled the halls. Italian violins, flutes, and pianos demonstrated musical craftsmanship unmatched elsewhere. Germans arrived with woodwork, philosophical furniture design, and folk art symbols. Russian artists displayed jewelry, icons, and intricate metal filigree, revealing deep layers of cultural meaning shaped by Orthodox faith. Meanwhile, craft traditions from India and the Islamic world introduced entirely different artistic philosophies. Indian textile patterns, paisley shawls, silk saris, embroidered muslin astonished Europe. Their colors appeared richer, dyes deeper, and patterns much older than Western products. Indian jewelry glittered with gold, precious stones, and enamel in styles unfamiliar to European eyes. The detail stunned visitors. Even expert craftsmen admitted they did not know how some Indian pieces were produced. Arab and Ottoman art also dazzled the crowds, especially geometric ornamentation, calligraphy, carpets, metalwork, and architectural models. Islamic art placed emphasis on symmetry and pattern instead of Western realism, showing that beauty did not depend on human portraiture. The exhibition, therefore, became a meeting place between cultures. For many British people, it was their first encounter with art from Africa or Asia, and the experience challenged preconceived beliefs about cultural hierarchy. Art argued silently that intelligence existed everywhere, not just in Europe. Some spectators left the palace believing the world was richer and more complex than textbooks suggested. The palace created emotional diplomacy. Beauty softened prejudices far more effectively than speeches ever could. Thus, the artistic component of the exhibition proved fundamental to shaping a global imagination. It reminded humanity that progress was not measured only by machines, but by meaning, expression, and spirit. The Great Exhibition reshaped decorative arts and everyday style throughout Europe and America. Before 1851, most households used simple utensils, undecorated glass, rough textiles, and handcrafted wooden furniture without ornate carving. But after experiencing thousands of aesthetic objects inside the palace, consumer desire evolved dramatically. People wanted elegant plates, printed wallpapers, patterned carpets, colored fabrics, and artistic home items. They wanted their homes to reflect global identity. Manufacturers recognized this shift and began mass-producing decorated objects, turning art into industry. Victorian interior design changed almost overnight. Households began displaying prints, pottery, embroidered curtains, and ornate ironwork inspired by what they saw at the palace. Exhibition catalogs sold tens of thousands of copies, allowing families to recreate design trends. Shops expanded product lines. Wallpaper stores printed patterns influenced by Japanese flowers or Indian paisley. Furniture makers studied German and Italian craftsmanship to improve stylistic sophistication. This phenomenon revealed a new cultural truth. Exposure to beauty changes daily behavior. People who saw elegant objects inside the palace no longer tolerated crude design. They demanded harmony between utility and aesthetics. Middle-class families began framing images on their walls because they believed art improved moral character. Victorian psychology argued that beautiful surroundings produced virtuous behavior and strengthened family relationships. Thus, the palace indirectly influenced domestic moral philosophy. Educational institutions responded quickly. The School of Design, which later became the Royal College of Art, expanded curriculum to include industrial drawing, interior design, and applied arts. Crafts such as embroidery and ceramic glazing gained academic respect. This academic framework empowered women especially, since textile and decorative art fields became socially acceptable professional paths. Some historians argue that the Great Exhibition contributed to early gender redefinition by providing space for female creative skills to enter national industry. At a deeper philosophical level, the exhibition challenged Western assumptions about artistic superiority. European artists realized that Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and Middle Eastern arts were not simply exotic curiosities. They represented complex civilizations with independent artistic histories. Victorian intellectuals began studying Sanskrit texts, Persian poetry, and Chinese porcelain traditions. Museums later created Asian art departments because public interest dramatically increased after 1851. This cultural blending produced both positive and problematic consequences. On the positive side, it diversified artistic imagination. Western designers borrowed motifs from African woodwork, Islamic geometry, and Eastern textiles. They experimented with hybrid ornamentation, mixing classical, medieval, and non-European influences. This eclecticism ultimately shaped the aesthetic movement, Art Nouveau, and arts and crafts movements later in the century. On the troubling side, cultural appropriation emerged. Some Western manufacturers copied designs without acknowledging origin cultures. Mass-produced carpets used watered-down Persian motifs. Cheap shawls imitated Indian textiles. European factories produced imitations that reduced original cultural meaning. Critics argued that industrial copying damaged authenticity and disrespected spiritual symbolism embedded in the original artworks. Still, the exhibition inspired serious scholarly attention. British archaeologists, historians, and linguists founded new academic societies dedicated to non-Western research. Libraries acquired manuscripts from India and the Middle East. Comparative religion studies expanded. Museums redesigned display cases to show artifacts not as trophies, but as historical evidence. The world was learning to interpret art scientifically rather than merely aesthetically. Finally, the palace elevated public music culture. Concerts were held, mechanical organs demonstrated, and pianos from multiple nations compared. This inspired a musical boom across Britain. Piano sales surged, concert halls expanded, and music education entered middle-class households. Thus, decorative arts at the exhibition did more than transform taste. They reshaped education, industry, scholarship, moral theory, and cultural exchange. They made beauty a public resource, not aristocratic privilege. What made the exhibition culturally unique was not the separation of art and industry, but their integration. Victorian thinkers claimed art improved science by shaping imagination, and science improved art by offering new materials. In the palace, artists used steel, aluminum alloys, chemically treated dyes, and optical lenses to push creative boundaries. Engineers studied artistic ornamentation to refine product design. Inventors borrowed aesthetics for marketing advantages. This mutual influence connected two worlds that had previously been distant. The exhibition also demonstrated that art could strengthen national diplomacy. Nations located their art galleries strategically, intending to influence international perception. France displayed silk portraits and jewelry to reclaim cultural dominance after military defeats. Italy showcased Renaissance ideals to remind Europe of its intellectual ancestry. Switzerland presented wooden crafts to advertise Alpine purity. India's artifacts suggested richness of empire. Each artistic choice was intentional political storytelling. For ordinary visitors, these galleries encouraged emotional travel. Standing before a Persian carpet, spectators imagined desert cities they would never see. Looking at Maori carvings, they considered distant islands across oceans. Art created mental journeys beyond maps. For millions who had never left their region, the palace opened psychological horizons. This transformed storytelling traditions. People returned home describing sculptures and textiles to neighbors. Teachers drew foreign patterns on chalkboards. Local artists imitated international styles. Journalists documented these effects. London newspapers wrote long articles about public astonishment at beauty they had never known existed. Writers described expressions on visitor faces: mouths slightly open, bodies leaning forward, eyes glowing. To witness such reactions was to witness cultural awakening. The palace also broke down the false Victorian belief that Europe alone represented civilization. Seeing Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Persian, Maori, Turkish, and African art side by side challenged stereotypes. While colonial bias remained heavy, some British observers wrote admiringly of other cultures, describing skill beyond their own education. This laid foundation for later anthropological study, art history expansion, and global museum collections. However, Parts of the exhibition reflected Eurocentric misunderstanding. Some cultures were displayed as curiosities rather than artistic equals. Labels sometimes simplified histories or ignored cultural contexts. Victorian observers occasionally interpreted non-Western shapes as primitive or exotic, revealing prejudices. Yet even when interpretation was flawed, exposure still sparked curiosity and dialogue. Progress is imperfect, but proximity often reveals humanity. Another cultural influence was emotional unity. People of different faiths, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, and others, stood together before artwork celebrating spirituality. They did not always agree, but they learned respect through presence. By merging art with industry, the exhibition shaped how future world's fairs would operate. Today, international expos still blend sculpture, architecture, myth, multimedia design, and technological showpieces. Entertainment pavilions, theme parks, public museums, and modern galleries remain rooted in Crystal Palace philosophy. Ultimately, the artistic heart of the exhibition demonstrated that progress is not simply the march of machines. It is also the expansion of empathy and imagination. The palace reminded millions that civilization is measured not only by factories and steam engines, but by memory, storytelling, form, pattern, color, and emotional truth. It told the world that beauty was not luxury, but necessity, a source of identity and power equal to iron or coal. That understanding shaped Victorian morality and reshaped modern culture. The Great Exhibition of 1851 stood at the center of the British Empire's global story. Victorian Britain was not merely a nation. It was the heart of a vast imperial network stretching from Canada to India, from the Caribbean to Australia, from West Africa to Hong Kong. Its ships sailed every ocean, its merchants traded across continents, and its administrators governed millions of people who had never seen Britain. When the Crystal Palace opened its doors, the British public walked among objects gathered from this colossal empire. They encountered raw cotton from India, wool from Australia, tobacco from America, furs from Canada, and minerals from African coasts. These materials filled display shelves and glass cases, and together they told the story of an international resource system controlled by London. Victorians believed that empire represented progress. They argued Britain spread law, Christianity, education, and scientific knowledge. The exhibition reinforced that belief by displaying colonial goods as gifts of global cooperation. Yet underneath that surface lay the darker truth. Empire was also built on exploitation, economic domination, military conquest, and cultural erasure. Objects displayed at the exhibition often masked the violence and coercion behind their presence. Raw cotton, for example, came from plantations shaped by systems of forced labor. Timber and ivory were taken through ecological destruction and hunting. Mineral specimens represented territories mined for British profit rather than local welfare. Still, for British visitors, empire visually appeared as proof of national strength. To them, the palace symbolized global unity under British leadership. Indian textiles glimmered beneath glass lamps, not as symbols of Indian autonomy, but as evidence of British commercial reach. African wood carvings looked exotic and mysterious, artifacts of lands Britain claimed to civilize. Colonial exhibits became propaganda, telling the British public that imperial rule was natural and morally justified. India's presence was especially significant. Queen Victoria's empire depended economically on Indian cotton, spices, and grains, and these products filled vast sections of the palace. Indian jewelry sparkled with emeralds and gold. Shawls woven with ancient techniques fascinated textile manufacturers. Indian architecture models showed domed palaces and Mughal temples, suggesting deep cultural worlds. Yet these displays were filtered through British interpretation. They showed India as timeless, unchanging, and dependent on British modernization. Visitors walked away believing empire was benevolent. Few questioned how colonization reshaped Indian agriculture, impoverished rural populations, or suppressed artisan industries. Australia and New Zealand contributed raw wool, minerals, and samples of agricultural produce. These colonies were young, expanding through settlement and displacement of indigenous cultures. Aboriginal and Maori artifacts, boomerangs, weaponry, carvings, cloaks, and jewelry were displayed not as equal civilizations, but as objects of curiosity. Victorian viewers rarely regarded indigenous art as sophisticated cultural language. Instead, they used the artifacts to justify colonization. If indigenous societies looked primitive, then British rule appeared as improvement. Canada sent timber, furs, printing materials, and agricultural products. These spoke to a colder, forested territory valuable for natural resources. The exhibits suggested that empire provided Britain with useful spaces, not sovereign nations with their own identities. African exhibits often arrived through missionary networks and trading companies. The objects offered insight into complex African societies, but British interpretation oversimplified them. Some saw African art as evidence of expressive emotional cultures. Others dismissed it entirely. These reactions mirrored broader imperial attitudes, admiration mixed with racial arrogance. The exhibition influenced how ordinary British people imagine the world. Many who had never traveled beyond their hometown now pictured foreign lands as colorful extensions of British capitalism. Empire felt personal, everyday, normalized. A British factory worker walking through colonial galleries saw proof that his labor connected to world markets. His factory cloth might end up in India or Africa. His tools might reach Canadian farms. The palace turned empire into lived identity. The exhibition also reshaped political language surrounding imperialism. Before 1851, colonial propaganda came primarily from elite speeches and specialized societies. But the Crystal Palace made empire visible and tangible for millions. Newspapers described the exhibition as the world beneath one roof, language that symbolically placed Britain at the top. Guided tours emphasized Britain's moral responsibility to uplift colonized lands, portraying empire as humanitarian obligation rather than commercial domination. This messaging appealed to British patriotism. Victorian society valued stability, order, and hierarchy. Empire seemed to offer proof that British values could organize the world. Prince Albert himself used carefully crafted speeches connecting empire to peace. He argued that shared economic interests among nations reduced warfare. But this idea ignored the fact that British imperial expansion often caused conflict, from Indian rebellions to African resistance. Still, the palace successfully blurred reality. It framed empire as collaboration rather than occupation, trade rather than extraction, cultural respect rather than political rule. Exhibits from colonized regions were curated to support this narrative. Displays rarely explained how British taxation affected local farmers or how forced labor shaped plantation crops. They focused instead on the beauty of resources: gold dust, feathers, ivory, spices, dyes, woods, and textiles. These goods impressed visitors with color, rarity, and exotic aroma. The palace created sensory immersion that replaced political critique with wonder. Representatives from colonized regions did not always control how their exhibits were described. Information labels were written by British interpreters using language that reinforced imperial stereotypes. Cultures with thousands of years of intellectual tradition appeared simplified to native craft. Some objects lost their original meaning entirely. For instance, ceremonial weapons displayed in glass cabinets looked like curiosities rather than sacred symbols. Religious items became decorative accessories. Even everyday objects like pottery, tools, and clothing lost cultural purpose. Yet within this imperial framework, important truths emerged. Colonized societies maintained artistic excellence, sophisticated science, and complex social systems. The exhibition revealed world cultures to each other, even if interpretation was biased. Some British visitors returned home questioning stereotypes they once believed. A small number of reformers began advocating for indigenous rights, citing artistic evidence seen inside the palace. The exhibition also sparked industrial competition. British manufacturers studied colonial materials to produce substitutes, reducing dependence on foreign imports. Textile industries experimented with Indian dyes to enhance British cloth. Woodworkers analyzed African hardwood to build stronger furniture. Agricultural scientists examined seeds to test soil compatibility. Empire became scientific laboratory. Another imperial dimension involved migration. Seeing colonial products encouraged some Britons to emigrate to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Brochures advertised fresh farmland and opportunity abroad. The exhibition therefore influenced demographic shifts across empire, expanding British settlement in places that displaced local communities. Finally, the palace laid moral groundwork for the later Victorian concept of civilizing mission. The idea that Britain must guide less advanced peoples grew partly from how cultures were displayed. Beautiful objects beside industrial machinery created contrast. Visitors believed Britain possessed superior technology, implying duty to share it. But this assumption ignored the sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and agricultural systems of colonized societies. Thus, the imperial ideology of 1851 grew not purely from arrogance, but from controlled interpretation. Empire was curated inside glass, polished to appear harmonious. The emotional effect of empire inside the Crystal Palace cannot be overstated. Visitors experience psychological transformation simply by walking through global exhibits. They encountered objects from lands they would never visit, faces from nations they would never meet, and stories rooted in histories they never studied. Empire expanded public imagination, but it also shaped identity through contrast. To feel British, many visitors unconsciously defined themselves against others. They believed Britain was modern, while colonized cultures were ancient. Britain was mechanical, while colonized societies were artistic. Britain was rational, while others were spiritual. These comparisons produced pride, but also simplified reality. Victorian literature reflected this mindset. After the exhibition, authors wrote adventure novels set in Africa, India, and the Pacific. These stories often combined admiration with racism, curiosity with domination. Characters traveled through mysterious jungles, befriended or fought indigenous people, discovered mythical treasures, or introduced European technology. Such books shaped generations of imagination, teaching readers to see empire as natural playground for British heroism. Children who visited the exhibition grew up reading these novels and later served as soldiers or administrators abroad. Empire became cultural expectation. At the same time, colonized intellectuals responded to the exhibition in complex ways. Indian writers acknowledged the technological brilliance they witnessed, but criticized the imperial arrogance in how Indian art was displayed. Some argued the exhibition undervalued centuries-old scientific achievements from their homeland. African observers questioned why European audiences misunderstood meaning behind their objects. This global dialogue marked early emergence of anti-imperial thought. For women, empire displays created mixed reactions. Some admired beauty from foreign lands. Others questioned why women in colonized societies were portrayed as passive figures needing rescue. This helped spark early feminist analysis of empire. The palace also exposed economic contradictions. Britain celebrated empire as source of wealth, yet working families inside London factories earned little from it. Visitors began connecting imperial profits to poverty at home. They questioned why cotton mills thrived while children lacked food or education. Socialists later used this argument to critique empire. Why rule the world if people at home are suffering? The exhibition unintentionally inspired this political awareness. Religion appeared everywhere in empire galleries. Missionaries used displays to claim moral success abroad. They pointed to schools, churches, and translations of scripture as evidence of spiritual triumph. Yet critics argued missionary narratives ignored cultural destruction. One of the most significant outcomes was awareness of cultural diversity. Even under imperial framing, people saw artistic genius from societies Britain once dismissed as inferior. They discovered India's textile complexity, China's porcelain mastery, Middle Eastern metalwork, West African sculpture, and Pacific navigation technologies. These discoveries planted seeds of respect that later influenced anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and comparative religion. Thus, empire at the Great Exhibition was contradiction embodied, exploitation and admiration, curiosity and control, celebration and erasure, education and misinterpretation. The palace displayed the world within European glass, not neutral truth, but curated worldview. Yet without that moment, millions would never have seen beyond their borders. The Great Exhibition of 1851 overlapped with a critical moment in the history of labor. Britain's Industrial Revolution had reshaped every aspect of daily life. Millions migrated from rural villages to factory towns. Child labor filled textile mills. Coal miners worked brutal shifts underground, and women stitched garments in cramped workshops for low wages. Before the exhibition opened, political debates over working class rights were fierce. The government feared uprisings similar to the 1848 revolutions that shook Europe. Public anxiety over poverty, unemployment, and mechanization dominated newspapers. Many wondered whether machines would eliminate human dignity or raise living standards. Against this backdrop, the Crystal Palace stood not only as display of innovation, but as stage for social transition. For the first time, huge numbers of working-class visitors could directly observe machines rather than merely labor beside them. Inside the palace, they saw steam engines not as threats, but as incredible examples of human ingenuity. Although fear did not vanish, many working families reported feeling proud that their nation produced such marvels. In some diaries, workers wrote that seeing engines made them feel part of something bigger, as if their repetitive tasks in factories now contributed to global progress rather than mere survival. This emotional shift, pride replacing resentment, helped stabilize industrial society. The exhibition also encouraged conversation about education. Victorian elites believed knowledge could improve morality and reduce crime among the poor. They argued workers needed not charity, but intellectual opportunity. Factory owners and philanthropists used the exhibition as evidence that working people wanted learning. They pointed to crowds of artisans studying microscopes and reading information plaques. Reports showed that visitors asked intelligent questions about materials, chemistry, and engineering. This challenged stereotypes that poor people lacked curiosity. However, deeper questions lingered. Were machines truly liberating the laborer? Would industrialization lead to shorter hours, safer factories, and fair wages? Or would it tighten control by factory owners? Some workers left the palace with mixed feelings: wonder at invention, grief over future unemployment. For example, a skilled craftsman might observe mechanical looms weaving fabric faster than human hands ever could. Pride transformed into anxiety because the palace made visible a future where machines could replace generations of skilled artisans. Others, however, believe mechanization would create new jobs: engineers, machinists, railroad drivers, telegraph operators, and clerks. The exhibition therefore became an intellectual battlefield where workers defined their relationship with industry. Labor reformers used the event to push government toward humane laws. They argued that if Britain celebrated technology, it must also protect its people. Reports from the exhibition helped fuel campaigns to limit child labor, expand factory inspections, mandate safety standards, and eventually form trade unions. Education activists pointed to visitor enthusiasm as justification to expand night schools, mechanics institutes, and public libraries. Britain's later literacy explosion owes part of its momentum to the exhibition's educational climate. Women working in factories also found new ideas inside the palace. They saw female-made artwork from France, India, and Germany. They observed tools designed for women's domestic labor, such as sewing machines that improved clothing efficiency, exhibits featuring female inventors or female artisans, though rare, suggested women might hold intellectual value beyond domestic space. Some Victorian women recorded that the exhibition opened their eyes to possibility, helping inspire early feminist movements focused on economic independence and education. Meanwhile, factory owners used the exhibition to study competitors. They observed foreign machinery, textile designs, and manufacturing systems. Many returned home determined to upgrade their factories, which increased the pace of industrialization. This expansion created more jobs, but it also increased the demand for coal and iron, worsening working conditions underground. Thus, the exhibition accelerated industrial development while deepening contradictions within capitalist society. The Great Exhibition helped transform Victorian charity from religious donation into scientific social reform. Before 1851, charity largely consisted of churches giving bread, clothes, or temporary shelter to the poor. Many Victorians believed poverty resulted from personal moral failure. The exhibition challenged this belief by proving that environment shaped human identity. When elites observed working-class families admiring art, studying machines, and participating in cultural life, they realized ignorance was not a natural state. Opportunity was. This philosophical shift encouraged policymakers to build institutions rather than handouts. Exhibition profits funded the South Kensington Museum complex, which later grew into the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, and a Natural History Museum. These spaces democratized education. Working people could now study objects similar to those displayed in 1851. This changed the relationship between labor and culture forever. Instead of cultural exclusion, society began to experiment with cultural inclusion. The exhibition also influenced debates about urban planning. In mid-19th century London, slums were overcrowded, filthy, and disease-ridden. Architects and engineers studying the Crystal Palace later applied ideas of ventilation, glass roofing, open public gardens, and wide pedestrian spaces to city planning. The exhibition indirectly inspired the creation of parks like Battersea Park, as reformers argued that clean air, nature, and sunlight could improve moral and physical health. This concept, environmental well-being as public resource, was revolutionary. Another major concept born from the exhibition was measurable public happiness. Organizers documented visitor reactions, ticket numbers, and social engagement. Their reports argued that exposure to art and knowledge uplifted emotional well-being. This evidence helped reformers push for compulsory schooling, arguing that mental stimulation improved national productivity. By the late 19th century, Britain introduced significant education acts. These reforms produced generations with broader literacy, scientific thinking, and political awareness. The exhibition also reshaped class interaction. Before 1851, aristocrats rarely engaged directly with workers except through employment. Inside the palace, they stood side by side as intellectual equals, at least for a moment. Though class boundaries remained strong, the palace created an emotional crack in the hierarchy. Some upper-class visitors reported respect for working families after witnessing their curiosity. Others began employing workers in more skilled technical roles. Trade unionism also evolved as consequence of industrial pride. Workers who saw machines understood complexity of industrial systems and argued they were essential to national prosperity. Instead of begging, they demanded representation. Later union movements used the exhibition as historical proof. Industrial success required collective labor, not just leadership vision. This strengthened bargaining power and shaped 20th century politics. Importantly, the exhibition fostered hope within the working class. The palace demonstrated that society could invest in beauty and knowledge rather than pure profit. Many visitors interpreted this as a sign that social mobility might be possible. Letters from Lancashire mill workers described feelings of rebirth after seeing art from Italy or France. They believed education might allow their children to become architects, teachers, or engineers. Yet, contradictions persisted. Even as the palace celebrated humanity, factories continued exploiting labor. Coal mines remained hazardous. Child labor persisted. Women earned lower wages. And many workers could not afford to stay long in London to enjoy the palace. But history does not measure progress in absolutes. It measures change. And the change triggered by the exhibition was deep. It encouraged society to treat working people as thinking citizens rather than economic tools. The relationship between industry and culture revealed at the exhibition also influenced Victorian debates about morality. Many feared that machines would corrupt social values. Rapid production could flood markets with cheap goods, encouraging material greed and weakening family traditions. Religious leaders warned that celebration of technology might lead people to forget God. Yet the palace helped soften these anxieties by presenting machines not as symbols of greed, but as expressions of human talent. Steam engines stood beside art galleries. Scientific instruments coexisted with religious texts. You've just finished exploring one of the greatest human achievements in history. Today, we saw how the Great Exhibition of 1851 changed everything: technology, science, art, trade, empire, gender roles, transportation, education, capitalism, and the shape of our modern minds. We learned how a glass palace turned Britain into world capital of invention, how workers, women, and children discovered knowledge and self-worth, how nations competed without war, using ideas instead of armies, how machines created new hope and new dangers, how museums, universities, and world expos were born, how colonized cultures gained voice, identity, and future independence, and how that single event gave birth to our global modern identity. The moral of this story is simple. When humanity chooses knowledge instead of fear, imagination instead of hatred, and innovation instead of violence, civilization moves forward. The Great Exhibition proves that ordinary people, united by curiosity, can change the world. Thank you for watching today's journey with this History Channel. More powerful histories are coming. So subscribe, stay curious, and return again, because this channel will continue unlocking the world's biggest stories. And your next favorite history is already waiting here. Until next time, take care, stay inspired, and never stop learning.